This is part 4 of our section on Judaism. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about practices and holidays and kind of the practical parts of Judaism. So this first page, I have a picture of a Shabbat dinner. Shabbat, also called the Sabbath, is the day of rest in Judaism. According to the Ten Commandments, the Israelites and Jews were commanded by God to take one day a week to be holy and to remember God. And on that day, Jews are not allowed to work, handle money, make food, drive cars, or do anything else. So the Sabbath is a quiet day. It's a day of family, and it takes a lot of preparation. Clearly, since you can't cook or use your cell phone to do anything on those days, you have to make a lot of preparations before the Sabbath. Now, the Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday evening and ends Saturday evening. So usually they'll have food and things ready. And when sunset comes, the family comes together in a home. The mother will say a prayer over these the candles you see here. She'll light the 2 candles, and she will invite the Sabbath into the home. The father will say a prayer over wine, and together the family will say a prayer over the challah bread. Now, challah bread has its roots in the story of Israelites wandering in the desert after they escaped Egypt. According to the legend, when they didn't have food, in the mornings when they would awake, they'd find manna out on the ground. Manna was like a kind of bread. And God would put this bread out for them when they couldn't find food. But on the Sabbath, they would need a little bit extra, because not only were they out in the desert, but on the Sabbath they couldn't even go out and look for food, look for locusts or anything else that they could eat. So God would leave them extra bread on that day. So challah bread is actually 2 loaves of bread woven together. So it represents the 2 pieces of manna that every person would get on the Sabbath. So just like so many of the other practices and traditions in Judaism, this one is very wrapped up in the history and the mythology of the religion, and allows modern practitioners to participate in those ancient stories. So today, or in this lecture, we're going to look at Jewish holidays and practices. We're going to look at the history of them, and I want you to pay attention to both how the holidays and the practices are interwoven with the history, with the mythology, but also with community and family. Community and family are very important in Judaism. This is a religion that has faced exile and has faced a lot of persecution. One way it stayed together is by showing loyalty to its family. We've talked about that before. So one of the most important practices or parts of practical Judaism is the Torah. Now, when Jewish people talk about Torah, they're talking about the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which are the books of Moses. But a lot of times when they talk about the Torah, they're talking about the Hebrew Bible as a whole, and all of the laws and all of the texts. For a lot of Jews, that's the Torah. The textbook does a good job of highlighting the most important parts of the Torah, the most important lessons of the Torah. First one is, of course, the one God, that there is only one God. It's a strictly monotheistic religion. Second is love for God. In the book, they include a quote from Deuteronomy, which says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." Now, if you come from a Christian background, you might recognize that, right? Jesus quotes this in the gospel, in the Christian gospel. "Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this is called the Shema Israel. The Shema Israel means the hear, O hear Israel, which is the first words of this prayer, or this commandment. So this is, the Jews really use this kind of idea to mold their idea of what love for God is. Love for God is remembering God all the time and keeping God in their hearts, but also in their bodies. In Hasidic Judaism and other forms of more Orthodox Judaism, you may notice that they, when they pray, they wear boxes right here on their foreheads and on their forearms. And that goes back to this Bible quotation that when you pray, you should bind them on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Those boxes actually contain quotes from the Torah, and a lot of Jewish men wear those when they pray. They're called tefillin. In addition, part of loving God is following God's commandments without asking why. It's a really important part of Judaism. There is a lot of discussion within Judaism. There's a lot of debate about how to interpret the Torah, but at the end of the day, an important part of Judaism is that you are loyal to God. You're loyal to God's commandments, and you don't always understand why God wants things to be the way they are. And when we hear from our guest speaker, Stephen, he talks about that and how that's important to him and plays a role in his life as a Jew. Another important part of the Torah is the sacredness of human life, and recognizing that all people, all human beings are made spiritually in the likeness of God, not necessarily in terms of image, in terms of legs and arms, but rather in terms of our spirits and our ethics and the way we treat one another and the way we are able to use reason and rationale and things like that. One of the major parts of the Torah is the law, of course. The law is very important. There are a total of 613 commandments in the Torah, and different Jewish sects have different interpretations of them and which ones are most important to be followed. But these commandments discuss everything within secular and sacred life. It doesn't make a differentiation between, those two. The law dictates all parts of a Jewish person's life. And a lot of them come down to just creating a good society on earth. They come down to how to live in harmony with one another and how to, be a good person, ethics, and so on and so forth. It's one thing that makes, Western religion unique is that Western scriptures set down very clearly how one should be a good person, what is right and what is wrong, right down to, secular life, to business dealings, to, the way we eat or dress or anything else. Asian religion doesn't do that as much. Finally, the Torah has a lot to say about suffering and faith. This is an important part of the Torah, especially for the Jewish people, because they have experienced so much suffering and persecution in their existence. So according to the Torah, everyone is rewarded or punished according to what they do. Things that happen on earth often happen because you're being rewarded or you're being punished, and that's a difficult thing. The book talks about how even during the Holocaust, people who were living in the concentration camps experienced both like this anger and a sense of hope as well when they thought of God. Anger that they are being punished, and hope that they would one day be rewarded for their suffering. So there's a great deal of emphasis in the Torah on how to deal with suffering and to have faith that you'll be rewarded for the good things that you do and the good person that you are. So basic sacred practices in Judaism includes scriptural study, remembering God in all aspects of life, ritual circumcision, what one eats, giving thanks, the Sabbath, and the Bar Mitzvah. Also the Bat Mitzvah. So we've talked a lot about how important the Torah is to the Jewish people, right? It encompasses the temple, it encompasses God, it encompasses their history, it encompasses their future. And so daily scriptural study is an important part of a lot of Jewish people's practice. And that fits into, trying to remember God in all aspects of life. As we said, the Jewish law does not only talk about sacred issues. It talks about secular life as well. And it's important that Jewish people, it's important for anyone practicing Judaism, that they find ways to bring God into other aspects of their life, whether that being putting a mezuzah on their doorpost. A mezuzah is a special a decorative box that you can put outside your door, and it contains part of the Torah in it. It blesses your home, or following the law in your business dealings, or being kosher and following the dietary laws put forth in the Hebrew Bible, that they can only eat certain foods. They can't have shellfish or pork. When they prepare their food, it needs to be prepared very cleanly, and so on and so forth. So God has to come into all aspects of their life. In some ways it's kind of comparable a little bit to Hinduism, right? Hinduism, the Dharma is a way of life. Ritual circumcision is done on boys when they're, I think, 8 days old, maybe 6 days old, and that is a sign of the covenant with Abraham, right? So from their earliest days, Jewish children are brought into the story of the covenant with God. As I mentioned, kosher is an important part of Jewish life. There are a lot of rules in the Hebrew Bible about which foods you can eat and can't eat and how they should be prepared. And it comes down to an issue of purity, right? And there are certain ways of preparing food and eating food that are reflect purity and keep your body pure, because your body is a temple. Modern progressive Jews have tried to kind of expand these ideas to include, only eating foods that are, ethically raised, or being maybe vegetarian, or I've heard of people not wanting to eat food that comes out of styrofoam containers because it'll pollute the earth. And there's a place for that. If you look carefully at the kosher laws, you can see that they deal a lot with ecology and treating animals well, and being ethical in your food choices. So the idea of kosher has expanded with kind of the younger generations to include a lot of other ideas as well. Giving thanks continually. There are prayers for waking up in the morning. There are prayers when you take a shower. There are prayers for when you eat. So always remembering and being grateful for what you have. Talked about the Sabbath and how that's a really important part of the week. When we look at Stephen's video, he talks a lot about the Sabbath and how important it is to him. And we're going to watch another video after this lecture that is about the Sabbath, and it's going to introduce a number of different Jewish people, talk about what the Sabbath means to them. Finally, the Bar Mitzvah, or the Bat Mitzvah. The Bar and Bat Mitzvah is a coming of age ceremony when young Jewish people turn 13 years old. They have a bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is the term for boys, and bat mitzvah is the term for girls. More Orthodox Jews do not have bat mitzvahs for their girls. Traditionally, it was something that only boys did. Leading up to their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, the children have to learn to recite certain parts of the Torah in Hebrew. Depending upon what their family wants, they might have to learn to read Hebrew and understand it. They have to undergo a series of classes and things that teach them about the history and the meaning of being Jewish. And then at their bar or bat mitzvah, you can see in this picture, they they will have to read part of the Torah. Their family will stand up with them, and they will stand up in their synagogue in front of the entire community, because this is a communal ritual. This is their entire community, their friends, their family, coming together to recognize their coming of age and their maturity into the Jewish tradition. And afterwards, there's a big party, and they have a tradition of putting the young man or young woman in a chair and throwing them up in the air. They do the same kind of thing for Jewish weddings as well. I've been to a bar mitzvah before, and I was struck by the sense of community there. The man undergoing his bar mitzvah, he had to read from the Hebrew Bible and things like that. But there were everyone else in the community was also reciting and singing and chanting, and it was a very powerful ritual. It was the person, my friend Stephen. It was like he was fully embracing the Jewish history himself. He hadn't just been raised in it. This was his turn to embrace it and to say that he was he's a part of it. He's going to be a part of it for the rest of his life. So it was a very emotional, very powerful ritual, and I really enjoyed being invited to it. So this is just a couple pictures of people at the synagogue. You can see on the Sabbath they go to the synagogue, but they go for holy days as well. So there is prayer, there is singing, and there are recitations, reciting from the Hebrew Bible at synagogue services, and it's done on Saturday morning. Sometimes they have Friday night services as well during the Sabbath. They go and they recite, and synagogue services revolve a lot around the Torah. Reform Judaism, which is, in some ways based on sort of the Sunday service, Christian Sunday service model, they might have sermons, or they might have, a time to kind of discuss what the scripture means. But for the most part, there isn't a lot of that. It's mostly just praise of God, reciting of the Torah, and singing. So that's what they do at the synagogue on the Sabbath. So in Judaism, as you can imagine, holidays all link modern Jewish people to their ancestry, to the stories of the Bible, to their mythology. Most of their holidays really are really linked specifically to stories. Rosh, for example, Hanukkah remembers a time of rebellion when the Israelites were rebelling against persecution, and when Jerusalem was being held by the Persians. Purim, which we'll talk about in a second, remembers the story of Queen Esther. Passover remembers the story of Moses. And so on these days, they will usually read and recite these stories from the Hebrew Bible, and allows them to kind of participate in the stories. Rosh Hashanah is the New Year's, is the Jewish New Year's that has a very strong spiritual significance. Sukkot is a harvest festival. A recent addition to Jewish holidays has been the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and there's also Shavuot. We're going to look at today, we're going to look at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We're going to look at Purim, and we're going to look at Passover. Okay. So Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, as I said. And it is usually more of a solemn kind of celebration. 30 days before Rosh Hashanah comes, in the temple, or not the temple, in the synagogue, they will blow this horn called the shogar. And it's a really kind of unusual sounding instrument. And it's meant to remind people that they stand at the foot of God. right? There's sort of a biblical metaphor there of the angels in heaven blowing their horns or announcing God, right? So for 30 days beforehand, there's a sense that Rosh Hashanah is coming, and Rosh Hashanah is not unlike a lot of other religions where New Year's is like a day of celebration. For the Jewish people, Rosh Hashanah is a time of looking inward, thinking about the previous year and thinking about your sins of in the last year and how to become a better person, right? So Rosh Hashanah comes. They have on Rosh Hashanah, they do have a large feast. They eat apples and honey in the hopes of a sweet year. But then they have, following Rosh Hashanah, they have another holiday called Yom Kippur. That's the Day of Atonement. So in Yom Kippur, which is the end of the new year, you are expected to make atonement for your sins. You're expected to find people you might have wronged in last year and apologize to them. In the synagogues, there will be a communal confession where the people will confess their sins and their errors to God and ask for forgiveness. There will be, it's very much a time of cleansing. You clean the house and try and clean out the impurities in your life. You try to settle any debts you might have, pay off credit cards, anything like that. So you can begin the new year kind of with a clean slate, right? So that's how Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are in Judaism. Probably the most major holiday in Judaism is Passover. That's when they remember Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, they have usually what they do is it's a family kind of thing. They don't go to the synagogue for it. Rather, they celebrate it at home. And this is really common for Jews, right? They love to celebrate things as a family, and in many of their holidays, they have symbolic foods that they eat, special foods with symbolic value. Passover is a good example of that. You can see here we have a family that's all gathered together. They're reading what is called the Haggadah. Everyone gets a Haggadah, and that is, it tells the story of Passover, it tells the story of the Exodus out of Egypt. And it tells this, everyone recites it, and there are places for everyone to kind of participate in this, right? So they eat, they have a special dinner called a Seder, and they have a Seder plate with several foods on it. The first food on it is a bitter herb, right? And there's several different herbs they might use. So bitter herb, and everyone has like a small bite of it. Now, keep in mind, the Seder meal, it's not an actual meal. You're not going to be full at the end of it. The Seder meal is just symbolic. It's just a ritual. It's part of the ritual remembering Passover, right? So first they each have a little bit of the bitter herb to remember the bitterness of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. Then they eat a little bit of this mixture of fruit and nuts, and it represents the mortar that went between the stones that the Israelites used when they were, building the pyramids and things like that in Egypt, right? You need mortar, you need cement to make the stones stay together. So that's representative of the work, the labor that the Israelites had to do as slaves. Then they take a bit of parsley and they dip it in salt water and they eat that, and salt water represents the Israelites' tears. Now at this point, the children who have kind of a special part in this meal, the children start reciting this question together. They start saying, "Why is this night different than any other night?" And that's a cue for the parents to explain to them what each of these foods mean and the story of the Passover and why they still remember it today. So it's ritualistic. It's putting them back in the time of the Israelites and that experience. It's making them one of those people, and it's also it's a teaching moment, right? So after the parsley and salt water, there is they make note of the shank bone. This is usually a shank bone from a lamb. There's no meat on it. You can't eat it. And what that represents is that traditionally, when they would celebrate Passover, they would make a sacrifice at the temple, but the temple was gone. So there's no lamb, there's no meat, there's just a shank bone to remind them of the sacrifice that they can't make, because the sacrifice of the lamb can only be made at the temple. It can't be made at the synagogue. It can only be made by the priest at the temple, which is gone. So what they do eat, though, is a bit of egg. Traditionally, in Jewish families, after a funeral, one of the first foods they would serve would be eggs. So they put out a boiled egg for everyone to eat because it represents mourning, right? First, they take the time to recognize that they can no longer have sacrifice in the temple because the temple's gone. And then they have some of the egg to remember the temple and to mourn the loss of the temple. The last thing they have is called matzah, and it is unleavened bread. I think this is it. That doesn't look like matzah. You can see it here. It's like this flat cracker of a bread. The reason why they use that is because according to the Passover story, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, the Israelites had no time to prepare food, or they only had a little bit of time to prepare food. They didn't even have time to let their bread rise before they cooked it. So they had this thin bread that they took with them as they escaped Egypt. Now, in a lot of families, what they'll do is they'll actually hide the matzah and they'll let the kids look for it. It's kind of like a little game for them because, again, they're trying to, the point of this is not just to recite all of this in kind of a dull, boring manner. They're trying to get the kids to participate in it so they can learn about it and they can understand it. So a lot of times they'll hide the matzah, and whoever finds the matzah gets like a prize or something. And the matzah is a reminder, or is a symbol of the flight from Egypt. So that's Passover. It is, I've had a chance to participate in a Seder as well, and it is a very interesting ritual, right? Because it's religious, it's historical, but it's also family. It's something you do at home with your family. It's not something you do in the synagogue with a rabbi. And family is so important in Judaism, and it's similar in some ways to the Shabbat, the Sabbath, when people gather in their homes and they eat the challah bread and they drink the wine and they light the candles and they celebrate their religion together at home with their family. The last one we're going to look at is Purim, and the reason I'm bringing up Purim is because we just passed it. Purim was just about a week and a half ago. Purim celebrates the story of Queen Esther, who was a Jewish queen, a Jewish woman who was married to a foreign king when the Jewish people were in exile in Babylon. The Babylonian king married Queen Esther because she was so beautiful. And she was a little bit nervous about being married to a Gentile, to a non-Jewish man, but her father convinced her that she might be able to do some good, that she couldn't understand what God's plan might be for her, and that she should just go with this and trust that things will work out. And sure enough, one of the Babylonian king's advisors hated the Jewish people and wanted to persecute them and wanted to send them away from Israel, or send them out of Babylon. And Queen Esther was able to use her influence with the king to protect her people. So on Purim, people remember the story of Queen Esther, but it's also kind of a fun, lighthearted festival. Jewish people dress up in costumes, as you can see here. And a lot of times they will go to the synagogue, or they'll gather together and someone will read the story of Queen Esther. And whenever Haman is his name, the name of the advisor who hated the Jewish people, every time his name is mentioned, everyone listening makes a lot of noise and curses his name. But in a lot of ways, it's just a very lighthearted kind of holiday, and they eat this special food, these special cookies with fruit, and it's quite delicious. And they also give a lot of money and food to charity on Purim as well. So as compared to Rosh Hashanah and Passover, Purim is more of like a lighthearted, fun holiday. So I wanted to bring that out. Okay, so I've included in this lesson folder a video on Shabbat. I think they do a really good job of showing the spirit of Shabbat. It's kind of a long video, but I encourage you to watch it and explain step by step what people do on Shabbat. And then the discussion for today is, how do community and family play into Jewish holidays and worship? How is community and family important to the way the Jews worship? Okay? Email me with any questions that you might have.